Kaelen was a name whispered in awe and fear within the roaring stadiums of the Muay Thai world. His body was a testament to a life of brutal dedication, every muscle a sculpted stone, every scar a paragraph in his story of triumph. He moved with a liquid grace that belied the devastating power coiled within his limbs, a predator in the ring whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. Champions had fallen before his precise, relentless assaults, their defenses crumbling under the barrage of his elbows and knees. He had collected belts and accolades until they became mere trinkets, memories of conquests that no longer stirred his soul. The fire in his eyes, once a blazing inferno of ambition, had cooled to the smoldering embers of a man who believed he had no equal, who saw the world through the lens of a victor for whom every challenge was simply another stepping stone. His confidence was not merely an act for the cameras or a tool of psychological warfare against his opponents, it was the very core of his being. It was a fortress built brick by brick with every victory, every grueling training session, every drop of sweat and blood shed on the canvas. He had pushed the limits of his physical form, honing his technique to a level of artistry that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. To Kaelen, the esoteric and the ancient were little more than fables, quaint stories told to frighten children or to give false hope to the weak. He believed only in what he could see, touch, and break. The spiritual world was a realm of shadows and whispers, irrelevant to the tangible reality of a perfectly executed roundhouse kick or a shattering clinch. This unshakable belief in his own physical supremacy was what drove him, what defined him, and what would ultimately lead him to the foothills of a challenge unlike any he had ever known. He would often speak to the press with a casual dismissiveness about legends and myths, laughing off tales of ancient warriors with mystical powers. "Show me a man," he would say, his voice resonating with the certainty of his convictions, "and I will show you his breaking point." He saw history not as a wellspring of wisdom but as a collection of outdated methods and forgotten fighters who would stand no chance against the evolution of modern combat sports. His trainers and sparring partners revered him, their own ambitions dwarfed by the sheer scale of his achievements. They saw him as the pinnacle of human fighting potential, a man who had perfected the science of combat. They reinforced his worldview, their admiration acting as a mirror that reflected his own image of invincibility back at him, larger and more imposing each time. This echo chamber of praise left no room for doubt, no space for the humility that often precedes true wisdom. The journey to the remote, mist-shrouded mountains was, for Kaelen, a pilgrimage of ego. He had heard the whispers from a local guide about a tomb, a sacred place guarded by a solitary figure who was said to possess an otherworldly skill. The story was meant as a respectful warning, a plea to leave the sacred ground undisturbed, but to Kaelen, it sounded like a challenge. He envisioned it as a public relations spectacle, another chapter in his legend where the modern warrior would effortlessly dismantle an ancient fraud. He packed his gear, his championship belts gleaming in his luggage, and gathered a small film crew to document his inevitable victory. The mountain air, crisp and clean, did nothing to clear the arrogance that clouded his judgment. Instead, he breathed it in as if it were the very air of conquest, filling his lungs with the same unyielding confidence that had carried him to the top of the world. As they ascended the winding path, the world of screaming crowds and flashing lights began to fade, replaced by an unnerving silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the call of unseen birds. Kaelen felt no intimidation, only a growing impatience. He viewed the serene landscape not with wonder, but as a primitive backdrop for his modern prowess. He imagined the footage, the stark contrast between his chiseled physique and the rugged, untamed wilderness. He planned the narrative in his head, the skeptical champion, the mysterious guardian, and the swift, decisive confrontation that would prove his point to the world. Every step he took was a step towards what he believed was a pre-written conclusion, a story where he was the hero, the author, and the undisputed victor. The possibility of any other outcome was a thought so foreign to him that it could not even find purchase in the fertile ground of his imagination. His interactions with the locals in the small villages dotting the mountainside were tinged with condescension. They spoke of the tomb guardian with a mixture of reverence and fear, their eyes wide with stories passed down through generations. They described a man who moved like the wind and struck with the force of a landslide, a protector of the spirits of his ancestors. Kaelen would listen with a smirk, his translator struggling to convey the depth of their belief. He saw their faith as a weakness, a product of isolation and superstition. He offered them money for more information, believing that everything, even sacred knowledge, had a price. He failed to see the quiet dignity in their warnings, mistaking their genuine concern for the naive ramblings of a people untouched by the real world he so thoroughly dominated. The night before he reached the tomb, his camp was filled with an air of anticipation. His crew checked their equipment, their excitement mirroring his own. They were about to capture a historic moment, the symbolic defeat of the old by the new. Kaelen sat by the fire, shadowboxing, his movements sharp and precise even in the flickering light. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the hunter's instinct that had served him so well in the ring. He was in his element, preparing for a fight, and to him, all fights were the same. There was an opponent, and there was a victor. He had always been the latter. The warnings of the villagers, the unsettling silence of the mountains, the weight of 1,000 years of history, all of it was just noise, the static before the main event, and he was ready to deliver the final, silencing blow. His mind was a closed circuit, impervious to any input that contradicted his established reality. He had trained his body to be an unstoppable machine, and in doing so, he had trained his mind to reject any notion of fallibility. He was Kaelen, the Muay Thai god, a living legend carved from discipline and pain. The concept of a power beyond the physical, of a strength not measured in muscle mass or striking speed, was utterly alien to him. He was a man standing on the peak of a mountain of his own making, so high up that he could no longer see the world below, only the reflection of his own summit in the vast, empty sky. This supreme self-assurance, this armor of ego he wore so proudly, would soon be tested by a force that did not care for titles, for records, or for the deafening roar of the crowd. As the dawn broke, casting long shadows across the valley, Kaelen stood before the ancient stone entrance of the tomb. He felt no sense of awe or reverence, only the thrill of impending confrontation. He had his hands wrapped, his shorts on, his body gleaming with a light sweat as he warmed up. The air was cold, but he was on fire, ready to perform, ready to conquer. He shouted his challenge into the gaping maw of the tomb, his voice a jarring intrusion into the sacred stillness. He was the champion, the pinnacle of martial evolution, and he had come to claim another victory. He was utterly convinced of the outcome, a conviction so absolute that it blinded him to the truth that stood silently waiting for him in the shadows, a truth that would shatter his world with the weight of a single, humbling touch. The guardian was a man who seemed more a part of the mountain than a resident upon it. His name was lost to the valley, replaced by a title of reverence, the keeper. He did not measure his life in years, but in seasons, in the passing of moons and the slow, patient growth of the ancient trees that surrounded the tomb. His skin was like tanned leather, etched with the fine lines of time and exposure to the elements, and his eyes held the deep, placid calm of a forest pool. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, each step deliberate and silent, leaving no trace on the mossy ground. He was not a warrior in the way Kaelen understood the word, he was a protector, a living conduit between the world of the living and the sacred slumber of the ancestors he was sworn to defend. His duty was his identity, a solemn vow passed down through countless generations. He did not train for combat, he practiced a form of existence that was, in itself, a perfect defense. His days were spent in meditation, in communion with the nature that surrounded him, and in the meticulous care of the tomb. He felt the subtle shifts in the wind, understood the language of the birds, and could read the history of the land in the stones beneath his feet. His martial art was not a collection of techniques to be unleashed upon an opponent, but an extension of this profound connection to the world. It was a discipline of yielding, of redirecting, of understanding that true strength did not come from imposing one's will upon the world, but from moving in harmony with its immutable forces. He did not seek to break, but to preserve, he did not strive for victory, but for balance. His power was not his own, but a force he borrowed from the very earth he protected. He had felt the champion's approach long before the echoes of his arrogant challenge reached the tomb's entrance. He felt it as a discordant vibration in the valley's energy, a tremor of ego and aggression that disturbed the peaceful equilibrium. He felt no anger, no fear, only a deep and abiding sadness for the man who was coming. He saw Kaelen not as an enemy, but as a lost child, blinded by the bright, fleeting lights of his own achievements, deaf to the ancient music of the world. The keeper knew that the confrontation was inevitable, not because he willed it, but because the champion's path of disrespect could lead him nowhere else. It was a lesson the mountain itself would have to teach, and he was merely its chosen instrument, a vessel for a wisdom far older and greater than any single man. His preparations for the encounter were not physical. He did not wrap his hands or practice his strikes. Instead, he sat in quiet contemplation at the heart of the tomb, surrounded by the cool, silent stones that held the dust of his lineage. He breathed in the heavy, sacred air, steadying his spirit, reaffirming his purpose. He was not preparing to fight a man, but to meet a storm. His goal was not to injure or to defeat in the conventional sense, but to quell the tempest, to restore the harmony that the champion's presence had so violently disrupted. He sought to offer a lesson, not a punishment, a moment of clarity, not a lifetime of shame. His strength was rooted in this profound sense of purpose, a foundation that the champion's physical power could never hope to shake. When Kaelen's shout desecrated the morning stillness, the keeper rose. He did not rush to meet the challenge, but moved with the same unhurried grace that characterized his entire existence. He emerged from the shadows of the tomb not as a fighter stepping into an arena, but as a mountain peak revealing itself through the parting mist. His expression was unreadable, a mask of serene neutrality. He wore simple, homespun garments that seemed to blend into the stone and moss around him. There was no weapon in his hand, no tension in his posture. He was the antithesis of the champion, calm where Kaelen was agitated, silent where Kaelen was loud, and rooted where Kaelen was restless. The contrast was stark and immediate, a visual representation of the two worlds that were about to collide. He observed the champion, his film crew, and their modern paraphernalia with a detached curiosity. He saw the taut muscles, the confident posture, the eyes that burned with a desire to dominate. He saw a man who had perfected the vessel but had neglected the spirit within. The keeper's gaze was not judgmental, but deeply perceptive. He could see the fear that lay hidden beneath the champion's bravado, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of losing the identity he had fought so hard to build. He understood that Kaelen's aggression was a shield, protecting a fragile core that had never been tested by true adversity, the kind of adversity that could not be overcome with fists and feet alone. It was a profound and silent understanding that transcended the chasm of language and culture that separated them. The keeper did not speak. Words were unnecessary. The language of the encounter would be written in intention and action. His silence was a presence in itself, a vast, empty space that seemed to absorb the champion's aggressive energy. Kaelen, accustomed to the pre-fight rituals of posturing and trash talk, found himself unsettled by the guardian's complete lack of reaction. He was punching at smoke, his intimidation tactics rendered utterly useless. The keeper simply stood, his feet planted firmly on the earth, his presence a silent testament to the enduring power of his tradition. He was a living statue, a guardian not only of the dead, but of a way of life that the modern world had all but forgotten. He was the embodiment of a principle that Kaelen could not comprehend, the idea that the greatest strength is found in yielding. Like a willow that bends in the storm while the mighty oak is broken, the keeper's philosophy was one of non-resistance. He had spent a lifetime erasing his own ego, becoming a hollow reed through which the power of the natural world could flow. He was not there to prove his superiority, but to fulfill his sacred duty. The outcome of the impending clash was, in his mind, already determined, not by his skill or Kaelen's power, but by the immutable laws of cause and effect, of arrogance and consequence. He was simply the fulcrum upon which the scales of balance would be righted. As Kaelen finally charged forward, a blur of motion and raw power, the keeper remained still. He was the eye of the storm, the calm center around which the chaos of the champion's attack would pivot. He was not just a man standing before a tomb, he was the physical manifestation of the mountain spirit, the collected wisdom of his ancestors, and the silent, unshakable guardian of a sacred trust. He was everything Kaelen was not, and in that moment, as the champion closed the distance between them, the keeper represented a truth that was about to be revealed in the most direct and undeniable way possible. The world of noise was about to be silenced by a force born of stillness. The champion's voice, amplified by his self-assurance, boomed across the tranquil landscape, a profane shout against the sacred silence. "Old man. I am Kaelen, the world champion. I have come to see this legendary power for myself. Face me, or be branded a coward forever. The words, spoken in his native tongue and crudely translated by a nervous aide, were a deliberate act of desecration. They were designed to provoke, to shatter the serene atmosphere and drag the encounter into the familiar territory of a street fight or a press conference. Kaelen stood with his chest puffed out, his fists clenched, a portrait of modern aggression set against a timeless backdrop. His film crew scrambled for the best angles, their lenses focused on capturing the anticipated humiliation of the local myth. The challenge was not just a call to a fight, it was a declaration of war by one worldview against another. The echoes of his challenge rolled down the mountainsides, startling birds from their nests and sending a subtle tremor through the ancient stones. The local guides who had led them this far huddled together, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and shame. They had warned him, pleaded with him to show respect, but their words had been dismissed as the ramblings of simple folk. Now, they could only watch as the line was crossed, as the sacred peace of their ancestral lands was torn asunder by the raw ego of an outsider. They began to chant softly, their prayers a whispered counterpoint to Kaelen's boisterous demands, a fragile shield of reverence against the onslaught of his pride. They were not praying for the keeper's victory, but for the valley's forgiveness. For Kaelen, this was all part of the performance. He was creating a narrative, and every good story needed a villain. In his version, the silent, reclusive guardian was the antagonist, a symbol of outdated traditions and baseless claims that needed to be exposed. He paced back and forth before the tomb's entrance, his movements a caged tiger's dance. He threw shadow punches into the air, the sharp hiss of his breath cutting through the crisp mountain morning. He was building his own energy, stoking the fire of his aggression, ensuring he was at his physical and emotional peak when the confrontation finally happened. He wanted not just to win, but to dominate, to leave no room for doubt, to create a spectacle so decisive that it would be talked about for years to come. The silence that answered his initial challenge was, to him, a sign of fear. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that was alien to the valley. He hides in the shadows. Is this the great protector? Afraid to face a real fighter, he taunted, playing to his camera crew, who dutifully recorded his every word. He failed to interpret the silence for what it was, a moment of profound patience, the calm before a storm. He mistook stillness for inactivity, and composure for cowardice. His entire life had been a whirlwind of noise and action, of roaring crowds and blaring music, and he had no frame of reference for the deep, resonant power that resided in quietude. He was a creature of the surface, unable to perceive the immense pressures that moved in the depths. He motioned for his translator to shout the challenge again, this time with more force, with more insult. The translator, a young man from a nearby village, hesitated, his hands trembling. To do so was a grave offense, a violation of the deepest tenets of his culture. But one look at Kaelen's cold, demanding eyes, and his resolve crumbled. With a voice cracking with fear and regret, he screamed the translated insults, the words feeling like poison on his tongue. He immediately bowed his head, whispering an apology to the spirits of the mountain. Kaelen merely clapped him on the back, oblivious to the young man's inner turmoil, seeing only an act of obedience. He was a general on a battlefield of his own creation, and he expected his orders to be followed without question. The keeper, emerging from the tomb's darkness, was the valley's answer. His appearance was not dramatic. There was no flash of light or clap of thunder. He simply was, where a moment before he was not. His presence instantly changed the atmosphere. Kaelen's taunts died in his throat, his laughter catching as a knot of unease tightened in his stomach for the first time. The champion had expected a wizened, frail old man whom he could easily overpower. But the figure before him, though aged, possessed a solidity, a rootedness, that was more intimidating than any display of muscularity. The keeper's eyes, calm and ancient, seemed to look straight through Kaelen's carefully constructed facade, seeing the small, insecure man within. Kaelen quickly shook off the feeling, mistaking it for a momentary lapse in focus. He fell back on his training, his body assuming its familiar fighting stance. This was his domain. He knew the angles, the timing, the mechanics of a fight. He saw the keeper's relaxed posture as a fatal error, an opening that he would ruthlessly exploit. "So, you finally show yourself," Kaelen sneered, his confidence returning like a tide. "Let's see if the legend is true." He began to circle the keeper, his feet light, his movements a fluid dance of death honed in 100 battles. He was the shark, sensing blood, ready to close in for the kill. He was assessing, probing, preparing to launch the first devastating volley of strikes. The keeper did not mirror his stance. He remained as he was, a silent sentinel, his hands held loosely at his sides. He did not follow Kaelen's movements with his head, but with his entire being, his stillness a perfect counterpoint to the champion's motion. The challenge had been issued and answered. The stage was set. The valley itself seemed to be holding its breath, the wind ceasing its whisper, the birds falling silent. The film crew held their cameras steady, their initial excitement now laced with a palpable tension. They sensed that this was no longer just a publicity stunt. The air crackled with an energy that defied easy explanation, a confrontation between two forces that represented the very soul of their respective worlds. The echo of the challenge had finally faded, replaced by a silence more profound and heavy than before. It was a silence pregnant with possibility, with the weight of history and the promise of a reckoning. In that moment, Kaelen was not just a fighter, he was the embodiment of the modern world's hubris, its belief in its own ultimate supremacy. And the keeper was not just a man, he was the embodiment of an ancient wisdom that understood that the greatest mountains are not conquered by force, but are humbled by time, patience, and the undeniable gravity of truth. The clash was no longer about a simple fight, it was about which of these two fundamental forces would prove to be the more enduring. With a final, sharp exhalation of breath, Kaelen exploded into motion. He closed the distance with a speed that was breathtaking, a blur of conditioned muscle and violent intent. His plan was simple and brutal, a series of feints to draw a reaction, followed by a powerful leg kick aimed to cripple his opponent's mobility, a signature move that had ended many of his fights. He was a machine of combat, every part working in perfect, destructive harmony. To the eyes of his film crew, it was a beautiful and terrifying display of athletic perfection. The modern world, in the form of Kaelen's flawless technique, was about to collide with the ancient, and the outcome seemed a foregone conclusion. It was the spearhead of progress against the crumbling wall of the past. The keeper, however, did not react as Kaelen's countless other opponents had. He did not flinch, he did not retreat, nor did he raise his arms in a defensive block. As the champion's kick scythed through the air, aimed at his lead thigh with bone-shattering force, the keeper made a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. It was not a block or a dodge in the traditional sense. He simply shifted his weight, rotating his body ever so slightly, his feet seeming to glide over the stone ground as if it were ice. He did not meet force with force. He yielded, becoming a void where a solid target had been just a microsecond before. He moved with the kick, not against it, borrowing its momentum and making it his own. Kaelen's leg, expecting the solid impact of flesh and bone, found only empty air. The sheer force of his own missed attack threw him completely off balance. His body, trained for the physics of impact and resistance, was now a victim of its own power. He stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past the guardian, his perfectly coiled energy unspooling into a clumsy, uncontrolled spiral. For a terrifying moment, the world champion was no longer a graceful predator but a staggering, disoriented man. The finely tuned machine had miscalculated, its programming unable to process an input so alien and unexpected. The clash had occurred, but not in the way anyone, least of all Kaelen, had anticipated. The keeper's movement was one of profound efficiency and harmony. He had not used his own strength to defeat the attack, he had used the champion's. He had become like the water that flows around a rock, or the wind that passes through a tree's branches. It was the physical application of a lifetime of spiritual practice, a demonstration of a power that was not generated, but channeled. As Kaelen stumbled past him, the keeper's hand, which had been hanging loosely at his side, rose. It did not rise with speed or aggression, but with a calm, deliberate purpose. It was not a fist, but an open palm, its motion as natural and unforced as a leaf falling from a tree. The world seemed to slow down. Kaelen, in his state of imbalance, was a whirlwind of flailing limbs, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. He was trying to regain his footing, to reset his stance, to bring his world of controlled violence back into focus. But he was lost in a sea of his own misdirected force. He was vulnerable in a way he had not been since he was a novice, his defenses completely dismantled not by a superior blow, but by a superior understanding of physics and energy. The fortress of his confidence, built on a foundation of predictable reactions, had been breached by an act of complete unpredictability. He was exposed, his raw power turned against itself. The film crew, watching through their viewfinders, captured the moment in stark, unblinking detail. They saw their hero, the unstoppable champion, suddenly and inexplicably falter. They saw the calm, almost gentle, movement of the old man. The narrative they had come to document was unraveling before their eyes, replaced by a scene that defied their understanding of combat. The expected explosion of violence had been replaced by a quiet, elegant dance of redirection. The clash was not one of blows, but of philosophies. It was the philosophy of brute force versus the philosophy of yielding, the world of the hammer versus the world of the water. And the water was, impossibly, winning. The champion's forward momentum carried him directly into the path of the keeper's gently rising hand. It was not a collision in the traditional sense. Kaelen was the storm, and the keeper was the unshakable point around which the storm was forced to pivot. The inevitable had happened. The two worlds, one of noise and fury, the other of silence and stillness, had finally made contact. It was a contact defined not by Kaelen's aggressive charge, but by the keeper's profound and patient reception of that charge. The champion had thrown all of his power, all of his training, all of his belief into a single, decisive action, and that action had been effortlessly absorbed and turned against him. The physical contact was about to be made, but the true impact had already occurred. It was the impact on Kaelen's perception of reality, the shattering of his core belief that physical power was the ultimate arbiter of any conflict. He had built his entire world on that single, unwavering principle, and in the space of a heartbeat, that principle had been proven false. The keeper had not fought him, he had simply allowed Kaelen to fight himself. The champion's aggressive energy, with nowhere to go, had rebounded upon its source. The clash of worlds was not a war, but a lesson, and the champion was the unwilling student. The final moment of the clash was one of almost serene beauty. The out-of-control champion, a testament to the peak of physical conditioning, and the placid guardian, a testament to the peak of spiritual harmony. One was all motion, the other all stillness. One represented the desire to conquer the world, the other the wisdom of living within it. As they met, it was clear that this was not a contest of equals. It was a demonstration of a higher principle, a truth so simple and yet so profound that Kaelen, in his arrogance, had never even considered its existence. The clash was over before the final blow even landed. The keeper's hand did not strike Kaelen in the way a fighter strikes. It was not a punch, a chop, or a palm heel strike designed to inflict pain or cause injury. It was something else entirely. As Kaelen stumbled forward, a victim of his own momentum, the keeper's open palm met his chest, right over his heart. The contact was deceptively light, almost a caress. There was no sound of impact, no jarring shockwave. For a split second, it seemed as if nothing had happened. Kaelen's mind, still reeling from the missed kick, barely registered the touch. He was expecting a counterattack, a knee, an elbow, something from the violent vocabulary he understood so well. This gentle, unassuming contact was utterly outside his frame of reference. But then, a force, unlike anything he had ever experienced, radiated from that single point of contact. It was not a concussive force that broke bones or tore muscle. It was a deep, resonant pulse, an energy that seemed to bypass his physical defenses entirely and strike at his very core. It was as if the keeper had not struck his body, but had plucked a string at the center of his being, causing a vibration that shook him to his soul. The champion's breath was driven from his lungs in a silent, explosive gasp. His eyes, a moment before burning with aggression, widened in pure, unadulterated shock. The world around him seemed to warp and dissolve, the vibrant colors of the mountain morning turning into a dull, gray haze. His body, a machine honed for relentless battle, simply shut down. His muscles, so taut and ready for action, went completely limp. The connection between his brain and his limbs was severed. He felt a profound and terrifying weakness, a feeling so alien to him it was like a new and horrifying sensation. The strength that had been his identity, the power that had defined his existence, drained away from him like water from a shattered vessel. He was no longer Kaelen, the champion. He was just a man, suddenly and completely powerless, his entire physical reality undone by a single, quiet touch that held the weight of the mountain behind it. He collapsed. It was not a dramatic, cinematic fall. He simply crumpled, his legs giving way beneath him as if his strings had been cut. He landed in a heap on the cold stone ground before the tomb, his body a tangle of uncoordinated limbs. He lay there, conscious but unable to move, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. He stared up at the sky, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw a breath. He saw the impassive face of the keeper looking down at him, not with triumph, not with pity, but with a deep, unsettling calm. In that moment, the champion understood the true meaning of defeat, a defeat that was not of the body, but of the spirit. The single strike was a lesson in humility, delivered with devastating precision. It was not meant to destroy, but to deconstruct. It had stripped away the layers of ego, pride, and arrogance that Kaelen had spent a lifetime building, leaving him bare and exposed. The keeper had not defeated an opponent, he had silenced a storm. He had used the absolute minimum amount of force necessary to convey the maximum possible meaning. It was the ultimate expression of his philosophy: true power does not lie in the ability to crush, but in the wisdom to know precisely where to touch. The strike was a pinpoint of focused energy that unraveled the champion's entire world. His film crew stood frozen, their cameras still recording but their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. The footage would show the charge, the stumble, and the quiet touch, but it could never capture the essence of what had transpired. It could not show the draining of a man's soul, the extinguishing of his inner fire. They had come to film a conquest, a victory of the modern world. Instead, they had captured an execution, the execution of an idea, the death of a false god. The silence that followed the champion's fall was more profound than any roar of a crowd, a heavy, sacred stillness that seemed to be absorbed by the ancient stones. Kaelen lay on the ground, the cold of the stone seeping into his body, a stark contrast to the fire that had always burned within him. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his body would not obey. He was a prisoner in his own skin, his formidable strength now just a memory. He saw the world from a new perspective, from the ground, looking up. He saw the impassive trees, the ageless sky, and the silent man who had brought him to this place of absolute humility. The single strike had not just defeated him, it had broken him open, forcing him to confront the emptiness that his ego had so effectively concealed. The keeper had not moved. He simply stood over the fallen champion, his duty done. The threat to the tomb had been neutralized, the harmony of the valley restored. The strike was a physical act, but its consequences were metaphysical. It had rebalanced the scales, demonstrating that the world was governed by laws far older and more profound than the rules of any ring or the ambitions of any single man. It was a message delivered without words, a truth communicated through a single, unforgettable point of contact. The invincible champion had been humbled, his story irrevocably rewritten by a single strike he never saw coming and could never have understood. This was not a loss to be avenged, for there had been no malice in it. It was a lesson to be absorbed. As feelings slowly, painfully began to return to his limbs, Kaelen knew that his life was now divided into two parts, the time before the strike, and the time after. Nothing would ever be the same. The man who had climbed the mountain seeking to cement his legend had instead found its complete and utter demolition. And in the ruins of his former self, amidst the rubble of his shattered pride, lay the faint, terrifying, and perhaps hopeful glimmer of a new beginning, born from the touch of a silent guardian and the undeniable power of a single, humbling blow. In the long, heavy moments that followed Kaelen's collapse, a profound silence enveloped the mountainside. The only sound was the champion's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. The film crew, shaken from their stupor, lowered their cameras, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. The spectacle they had come to capture had transformed into a sacred, uncomfortable intimacy. They were no longer documenting a fight but witnessing a man's complete unraveling. The brash, confident hero they had followed up the mountain was gone, replaced by a broken figure lying helpless on the ground. The narrative was shattered, and they had no idea how to piece it back together. Their modern equipment felt like useless, profane trinkets in the face of what had just occurred. The keeper turned away from Kaelen. He did not offer a hand, nor did he utter a word of triumph or condemnation. His role in the drama was over. He had acted as the mountain's immune system, neutralizing a threat with surgical precision, and now he was receding back into his purpose. He walked slowly, deliberately, back towards the shadowed entrance of the tomb, his movements as calm and unhurried as they had been before the confrontation. He was returning to his vigil, to his communion with the ancestors. The world of men, with its fleeting glories and loud proclamations, was of no concern to him. His legacy was not written in the annals of human achievement, but in the enduring peace of the sacred ground he protected. Slowly, painfully, Kaelen regained control of his body. He pushed himself into a sitting position, every movement an enormous effort. The world was still muted, his senses dull, but clarity was beginning to dawn in his mind, a terrible, humbling clarity. He looked at his hands, the instruments of his power, and saw them for the first time as just flesh and bone. He looked at the tomb, at the silent trees, at the vast sky, and felt an overwhelming sense of his own smallness. The arrogance that had been his armor had been stripped away, leaving him raw and vulnerable. He was no longer a champion, he was just a man who had been shown his true place in the vast, indifferent cosmos. Humiliation washed over him, followed by a strange, unfamiliar feeling, reverence. The journey down the mountain was a silent, solemn procession. Kaelen did not speak. He walked with his head bowed, his powerful frame slumped in defeat. The vibrant confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet, introspective grief. He was mourning the death of the man he thought he was. His crew walked behind him, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a respectful quiet. They occasionally glanced at their fallen hero, not with pity, but with a newfound sense of wonder. They had witnessed a miracle, or a nightmare, and they knew that the footage they carried held a power far beyond that of a simple fight video. It was a recording of a soul being fundamentally altered. News of the event trickled out, but it was garbled and unbelievable. The footage was never released in its intended form. It was edited, cut, and presented as a respectful visit to a cultural site, with the central, humiliating event left on the cutting room floor. Kaelen's management team spun a story of a knee injury during training to explain his subsequent withdrawal from the public eye. The world champion simply vanished, his meteoric career ending not with a bang, but with a whisper. The official story protected his marketability, but it could not erase the truth that was now seared into his soul. The real story lived on only in the memories of those who were there, and in the quiet, unreleased data on a hard drive. Kaelen never fought again. He could not. The fire was gone. The certainty, the aggression, the belief in his own physical supremacy, all of it had been extinguished by that single, gentle touch. He sold his lavish homes, gave away his championship belts, and disappeared from the world that had once worshipped him. Rumors would surface from time to time. He was seen meditating in a remote monastery, living a simple life in an anonymous village, or studying under an old master of a forgotten art. He was searching, not for a way to regain his power, but for a way to understand the power that had so effortlessly undone him. His quest was no longer for glory, but for meaning. The keeper's legacy was not altered by the event. For the people of the valley, it was simply a reaffirmation of what they already knew. The mountain protected itself. The ancestors watched over them. The guardian was their shield. The story of the arrogant champion who was humbled at the tomb's entrance became another tale told to children, a lesson about the importance of respect and the folly of pride. The keeper himself would continue his silent vigil, his existence a testament to the enduring power of tradition, balance, and harmony with the natural world. His name remained unknown, his legend preserved not in headlines, but in the whispered reverence of his people. The true aftermath was not the end of a career, but the beginning of a transformation. Kaelen's defeat was his salvation. It forced him onto a path he would never have chosen, a path of humility, self-discovery, and spiritual awakening. The strike that had broken his body had, in a way, healed his soul. It had shattered the prison of his ego and set him free. He had gone to the mountain to prove he was a god, and had instead learned what it was to be a man, flawed and finite, but capable of growth and change. The pain of his humiliation was the price of his wisdom. And so, the two legacies became intertwined. The silent guardian, who sought no recognition, became a catalyst for profound change in another's life. And the fallen champion, through his humbling, became a quiet testament to the guardian's power. One represented the enduring strength of ancient wisdom, the other the possibility of redemption even for the most arrogant of souls. The echo of that single strike did not fade, it resonated through a man's life, changing its course forever, a quiet but powerful testament to the fact that the greatest victories are often born from the most profound defeats. What happens when a modern legend, a warrior forged in the crucible of roaring stadiums and brutal competition, seeks to conquer a power that exists beyond his understanding? Kaelen, the undisputed Muay Thai champion of the world, was a man who believed only in the tangible reality of strength and skill. For him, ancient myths were just stories. But when he brought his cameras and his arrogance to the foot of a sacred, mist-shrouded tomb, he found a truth that could not be broken by fists or feet. He found a silent guardian, a man who was more myth than muscle, who protected a legacy written in stillness, not violence. The champion issued his challenge, expecting a quick and spectacular victory. What he received instead was a single, life-altering lesson, a moment that would shatter his world and redefine the very meaning of power. This is the story of that clash, a tale of pride, tradition, and a single strike that humbled a king.